Imagine walking into a bustling Roman marketplace, not to buy bread or wine, but to buy another human being. Chains rattled as men, women, and even children stood on display. Above their heads hung wooden plaques detailing their age, health, and skills, like cattle waiting to be sold. The crowd pushed forward, bidding loudly, while the condemned stood silent, knowing their future depended on the highest bidder. Some sold for the price of a loaf of bread. Others fetched fortunes worth more than a villa. But behind each transaction lay a system built on cruelty, profit, and survival. This is the chilling story of money, power, and human lives in ancient Rome. This is the tragic story of slavery and greed. The slave market in Rome was no ordinary bazaar. It was the beating heart of an empire built on chains. To the Romans, slavery was not a side effect of war, it was the very fuel of civilization. Imagine an empire of gleaming marble, colossal amphitheaters, and endless roads stretching from Britain to the deserts of Arabia. Behind this grandeur was not Roman ingenuity alone, it was human bondage. At its height, it is believed that in Rome itself, there was one enslaved person for every 3 free citizens. Some scholars estimate that in Italy, the enslaved may have made up almost half the population. Wars, conquests, and piracy fed this insatiable hunger for forced labor, and the buying and selling of people became as natural to Romans as trading wheat, olives, or wine. The markets themselves were spectacles of power and cruelty. Known as the Fora Venalium, they were sometimes temporary setups in open squares, other times permanent structures, their wooden stages scarred by the weight of countless lives bought and sold. Picture rows of raised platforms where men, women, and children stood in silence. Each wore a placard, the titulus dangling from their neck, a humiliating advertisement that listed their qualities: strong worker, literate, trained cook, virgin, skilled gladiator. Their humanity reduced to bullet points for consumption. Potential buyers crowded around, greedy eyes scanning bodies like livestock. They forced mouths open to inspect teeth. They pressed muscles, slapped shoulders, and traced scars with mocking curiosity. Some even demanded to examine private features. The degradation was deliberate. By stripping individuals of dignity, Rome transformed them into commodities. Shame was part of the price. It broke the spirit before chains did. So, how much did Romans pay for these souls? The answer was complex. Because the empire valued people like tools, ranked on origin, strength, skills, and beauty. A basic unskilled laborer, perhaps a captured soldier, a Gaulish farmer, or a petty criminal might be sold for between 500 and 2,000 sesterces. To a Roman soldier, this was only a few months' wages. Cheap enough to be disposable, these enslaved workers were purchased in bulk to till the fields, dig ditches, or carry bricks for the massive building projects that reshaped Rome into the marble capital of the world. They were the fuel thrown into the fire of empire, burned out and replaced without thought. But the prices could climb into the stratosphere for those with rare talents. Educated Greeks were the jewels of the market. For centuries, Greece had been admired for its art, science, and philosophy. When Rome conquered Greece, it did not merely loot its temples, it captured its minds. A Greek philosopher, mathematician, or doctor could fetch 20,000 to 50,000 sesterces, the equivalent of a luxurious townhouse in the capital. Rich Roman families paraded these enslaved intellectuals like trophies, boasting that their children were taught by a man from Athens or Rhodes. Knowledge itself had been conquered and priced. Women were subject to even crueler calculations. A young, beautiful girl might fetch 10,000 sesterces or more, her worth measured not by her mind but by her body. Older women, or those deemed undesirable, were sold cheaply, often to toil in kitchens or laundries. Many young women were bought as concubines, entertainers, or worse. Their lives were not their own. They were extensions of Roman appetites. The marketplace was not just commerce, it was institutionalized violation. Then there were the gladiators, Rome's most terrifying investments. A strong Thracian or Gaul, trained for combat, could sell for 100,000 sesterces. And if he showed potential to captivate crowds, the price could soar higher still. These men were not just fighters, they were living wagers in a game of death. Owners calculated their value the way a modern investor might calculate the worth of a racehorse or a prize fighter. A gladiator who survived long enough could become a celebrity, a human spectacle whose blood entertained emperors and mobs alike. The auctions themselves were theater. Enslaved men were made to lift weights to prove strength. Women were paraded half-naked, their beauty judged like cattle at a fair. Children were forced to sing, recite, or run across the stage to display health and spirit. Under Roman law, if a buyer discovered a hidden flaw not listed on the placard, they could demand a refund, as if a human being were a broken piece of pottery or a faulty piece of furniture. Behind these numbers, though, lay countless tragedies. A Gallic farmer, captured in a raid, sold for a few coins, never to see his homeland again. A Greek philosopher, once honored in public debates, reduced to standing mute while Roman nobles bid for him as if he were a rare animal. A child, torn from its mother's arms, sold for less than a set of kitchen tools. Each sale was a small act in the theater of Rome's moral collapse. The markets were not hidden. They were proudly displayed, and foreigners visiting Rome wrote about them. Poets and philosophers described the spectacle with a mix of fascination and horror. For the Romans, the slave market was proof of dominance. Every chained body was a reminder that the empire could conquer not just land, but people themselves. To them, slavery was not shameful. It was natural. That acceptance of cruelty was the foundation upon which Roman greatness was built, a greatness paid for in broken lives. At the lowest tier were the mass slaves, those captured during war, seized by pirates, or convicted as criminals. These were individuals whose lives were considered disposable, bought cheaply to serve in the mines, quarries, or vast agricultural estates. A man forced to dig silver in the Spanish hills or work marble in Italy might sell for 300 to 600 sesterces, barely more than the cost of a mule. Life expectancy in such conditions was appallingly short. Months of relentless labor, coupled with harsh punishments and minimal sustenance, meant that many of these enslaved workers perished before they had even seen their 20s. Roman owners were well aware of this. They purchased cheap labor, knowing that their profits would come at the cost of human suffering, sometimes in the span of mere years. The cheapest of human life, yet indispensable to the empire's grand designs. Above these expendables were household slaves, those slightly more valuable because of their ability to serve in domestic spaces or manage wealth. A competent cook, laundress, or butler might fetch between 1,000 and 3,000 sesterces. A trained secretary, accountant, or estate manager could command 10,000 sesterces or more. These slaves were entrusted with responsibilities that free citizens often could not manage. They oversaw finances, managed estates, and even negotiated transactions on behalf of their masters. In some cases, a wealthy Roman relied more on a trusted slave than on a family member. Ironically, this trust sometimes provided a path to freedom. Loyal household slaves might be manumitted after decades of service, transforming from property into freedmen who contributed to Roman society. But while trust could lead to emancipation, it did not erase the humiliation endured for years under constant scrutiny. The uppermost echelon of the market involved specialists, human beings, whose skills made them near priceless. Greek physicians, often trained in medicine, anatomy, and pharmacology, could demand tens of thousands of sesterces. Philosophers and teachers, especially those skilled in rhetoric, literature, and philosophy, could cost even more. Roman elites were eager to display such acquisitions, flaunting their purchases as both a mark of wealth and a signal of cultural sophistication. Imagine a dinner party in the palatial home of a senator. A Greek rhetorician instructs a young Roman noble, bought for the price of a luxurious villa, reciting poetry and philosophy while the host sips wine and counts his wealth. Knowledge itself had been enslaved, a testament to the empire's power and a stark reminder of the brutality underlying its glory. Yet skill was only part of the equation. Beauty had its own cruel price. Young, physically attractive slaves, male or female, could command staggering sums. Roman elites maintained harems, concubines, and attendants, often chosen for nothing more than their appearance. Sources describe girls purchased for 10,000 sesterces, 20,000 or more, depending on age, health, and perceived allure. Their lives were precarious, subject to their owners' desires, and their bodies became both currency and spectacle. Male slaves with striking features or strong physiques could also fetch high sums, particularly if they were trained to entertain, serve, or fight in arenas. Wealthy Romans valued aesthetics almost as highly as utility, willing to spend fortunes for the allure of youth, beauty, and novelty. Then there were the gladiators, the blood-soaked investment of the empire. A well-trained Thracian, Gaul, or Samnite could sell for 100,000 sesterces, with prices sometimes climbing to 200,000 for a fighter with proven skill or exceptional potential to captivate crowds. Gladiators were not merely tools of amusement. They were living commodities whose performances could bring fame, wagers, and prestige. Owners calculated risk versus reward with meticulous attention. A gladiator might die in combat, be severely injured, or survive to become a crowd favorite. Each bout was an economic equation, each life measured in sesterces and prestige. The higher the risk of glory or death, the higher the price, reflecting the merciless calculus of Roman society. The historical record paints a terrifying picture of human valuation. Historians like Pliny the Elder and Suetonius recorded transactions that defy belief. A slave secretary could be sold for 700,000 sesterces, more than the combined wealth of many estates, because of rare skills in administration and literacy. Eunuchs, particularly in eastern provinces, fetched extreme prices for roles in imperial households, demonstrating Rome's obsession with rarity and control. Markets were a theater of extremes. The cheapest labor was near expendable, while rare talent or beauty was treated as precious beyond measure. Deception and corruption were woven into the system. Slave traders frequently misrepresented age, health, or ability, sometimes fattening weaker slaves to feign vitality or hiding injuries and illnesses. While Roman law theoretically allowed refunds if buyers discovered deception, enforcement was lax. By the time complaints were made, the damage, both physical and psychological, was already done. Enslaved people endured the public inspection, the humiliation of comparison, and the indignities of false advertising. The system relied not merely on ownership but on the normalization of degradation, training both buyer and seller to see human beings as merchandise. Ownership, wealth, and status were inseparable. In Roman eyes, owning hundreds of slaves demonstrated prestige. Owning thousands elevated a citizen to near imperial rank. The sheer number of human beings under one's control was a social statement, a twisted ladder of social hierarchy. Yet this obsession came with invisible dangers. Slaves were everywhere, in kitchens, bedrooms, offices, and palaces. They overheard secrets, managed fortunes, and endured punishment silently. The potential for betrayal, theft, or revolt loomed constantly. Roman masters lived with the knowledge that their wealth, power, and lives could be undone by the very people they owned, making trust and fear two sides of the same coin. The marketplace of Rome, therefore, was not merely a commercial institution. It was a mirror into the empire's soul. The way value was assigned revealed priorities, prejudices, and a moral framework that equated utility with worth. Behind the rows of wooden platforms, behind the placards, and behind the coins exchanged, lay the intimate details of a society that had commodified the human experience. To walk through a Roman slave market was to witness the empire's wealth and its darkness simultaneously. Brilliance built on suffering, intellect purchased at the price of liberty, and beauty exploited for currency. From the cheapest farmhand to the most sought-after philosopher, the marketplace exposed a hierarchy where life itself had variable worth. The Roman economy thrived on this brutal stratification, and its consequences rippled across every aspect of society, from the construction of roads and temples to the upbringing of children and the education of elites. Each coin spent was a reminder that behind Rome's gleaming monuments and triumphant legions lay the bodies and spirits of millions of people, their lives measured, priced, and exchanged like mere objects. The question, how much did Romans pay for their slaves, captures only the surface of a much deeper, more harrowing truth. The sesterces exchanged in bustling markets were only a fraction of the cost. The true price of Rome's slavery was measured in lives destroyed, families torn apart, and an empire morally corroded from the inside out. Beyond mere coins, it was a debt paid in suffering, in broken bodies, and in the corruption of an entire civilization. First, consider the psychological toll. Slavery dehumanized not only the enslaved, but also the masters. Roman society became inured to cruelty, viewing suffering not as tragedy but as entertainment. The Colosseum was the ultimate emblem of this worldview. Tens of thousands of spectators gathering to watch human blood spilled in gladiatorial combat, a spectacle funded by the very system that treated people as property. Young Roman children learned early that human life was a commodity to be used, abused, and discarded. Empathy was dulled, morality eroded, and brutality celebrated as a marker of civilization. What one could earn in sesterces seemed trivial compared to the price paid in compassion, humanity, and conscience. Then there was the economic cost, hidden in plain sight. The importation of millions of slaves through wars, raids, and piracy had a profound effect on the Roman labor market. Small farmers and free laborers could not compete with estates powered by virtually free disposable slaves. Many were ruined financially, their lands abandoned or sold off cheaply. This economic imbalance fueled unrest, social tension, and resentment. It was the seed of populist movements, revolts, and political upheaval, as ambitious leaders promised to redress inequities that Rome's elite had created through dependence on enslaved labor. The glittering palaces, the marble columns, and the grandeur of the empire masked a population of dispossessed citizens, their lives crushed by a system designed to enrich others at any cost. The political fragility of Rome was also revealed through the rebellions of enslaved people. Though most were brutally suppressed, the fear of revolt was constant. The most famous uprising was led by Spartacus in 73 BCE, when thousands of gladiators and slaves rose in rebellion, challenging the might of Rome itself. Though ultimately defeated with ruthless efficiency, the rebellion demonstrated a universal truth. Every enslaved individual was a potential threat, every household a battlefield waiting to ignite. Roman masters knew that their wealth and safety relied not only on physical dominance, but on an endless cycle of fear, punishment, and control. Slavery, in its essence, was a political tool as much as an economic one. The system's cruelty extended even into family life. Roman masters frequently fathered children with enslaved women, condemning offspring to the status of slave from birth. Generations were born without hope of freedom, caught in a cycle of exploitation and servitude. Families were split at auctions, entire communities eradicated, their people scattered across the empire. Tribes, villages, and cultures were extinguished, and the cost could never be calculated in sesterces. A child sold away from their parents, a woman separated from her siblings, a man forced into a mine. Each story was a small tragedy that collectively formed the dark undercurrent of Rome's glory. Religion, too, was enmeshed in the machinery of oppression. Romans believed the gods favored the empire, yet the temples, roads, and festivals celebrating victories were often built by enslaved hands. Priests owned slaves. Rituals were funded by wealth extracted from human suffering. Slavery had been normalized to the point where cruelty became sacred and chains seemed divine. The very structures that testified to Rome's power were monuments to human misery. Triumphs were celebrated, but every parade, every victory, and every construction project carried the hidden cost of countless enslaved lives. And yet, within this bleak framework, resistance endured. Some enslaved people found freedom through manumission, becoming freedmen who contributed to society in art, trade, and politics. Others resisted more subtly: theft, sabotage, escape, or the quiet assertion of dignity within the confines of bondage. Despite the overwhelming machinery of oppression, Enslaved individuals maintained agency whenever possible, proving that even under extreme exploitation, the human spirit persisted. However, these victories were often small, isolated, and insufficient to challenge the broader system. The empire itself could not escape the shadow of its choices. Slavery permeated every layer of society, shaping culture, law, and economics. Wealth and power were inseparable from ownership of human beings, making moral corruption a systemic problem. When Rome eventually fell, the institution of slavery remained one of its most enduring legacies, influencing medieval Europe and the centuries beyond. The idea that humans could be bought, sold, and owned survived long after the marble columns crumbled, leaving a moral stain that extended far beyond the empire's physical demise. The real cost of Roman slavery extended to intellect, culture, and knowledge. While Greek slaves brought philosophy, medicine, and rhetoric into the empire, they did so under duress. The spread of knowledge was built on coercion, and the brilliance of Greek minds was purchased at the price of freedom and dignity. Every lesson taught, every mathematical theorem explained, every medical procedure performed was entwined with the chains of servitude. Culture itself became a commodity, another transaction in the marketplace of human exploitation. So, how much did Romans pay for their slaves? In coin alone, the range was staggering. From a few hundred sesterces for an unskilled laborer to hundreds of thousands for rare talents or gladiators, and sometimes even more for prized beauty or exceptional skill. But the true cost, immeasurable in sesterces, was paid in stolen lives, psychological torment, and the moral degradation of an entire civilization. Each slave sold, each life reduced to a placard, each auction was a reminder that Rome's splendor rested on a foundation of suffering. Rome's greatness, its engineering marvels, its art, its law, and its literature were built on chains. Its glory, celebrated in history books and monuments, was stained with misery. Behind the marble facades, the triumphal arches, and the grandeur of emperors lay a market of human suffering, where no coin could measure the true price. Enslaved people were not merely a resource, they were the engine of empire, the silent architects of Rome's dominance, and the hidden cost of its civilization. The story of Rome's slave markets is more than a tale of economics. It is a lens through which we can understand power, morality, and the consequences of dehumanization. The legacy of human pricing, of valuing lives by skill, beauty, or strength, echoes through history, warning us of the dangers of seeing people as commodities. Rome's wealth was bought with more than labor, it was purchased with the erasure of humanity itself. If this journey into the darkest corners of Rome's economy has shocked you, consider what other hidden truths history may conceal. Like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications to explore more untold stories of the past. Comment below, what do you think was the true cost of Rome's empire? History is rarely as glorious as the textbooks suggest, and the lessons of slavery remind us that behind every empire lies suffering that cannot be measured in gold.